Hello. Earlier in the summer I had a go at making some progress on my 1:450 Dawlish T Wall layout build, but things didn't go to plan this time. Last time around I successfully laid track across the baseboard divide and along most of the remaining scenic section, stopping just after the bridge over the brook. I realised a little later I'd forgotten about installing infrared light sensors on the northwest section to detect trains approaching an area where I'd like to have some signals. I tested these sensors ages ago under a piece of track and they'd worked. The idea with these sensors was to drill holes between sleepers, so I found the best spots for them and drilled the holes for the down line. The sensitivity of these sensors is adjustable, but when I was test fitting one it was always triggering. There isn't much shielding between the transmitter and sensor, so I made a little surround for one end using some rolled cardboard. It was still triggering though, even with that cardboard surround being pushed right up against the wood. Light was still getting to the sensor when I don't want it to be. After a fair bit of fiddling around with this, I decided it was going to be too difficult to get it working, and that I can use track current sensors instead. Current sensing is also something I've experimented with in T-gauge, and had working. Last time I did track laying, Copydex glue held the track in place very reliably, so I took the same approach this time, pre-shaping the track as much as possible first. On the real railway, the track curves gently towards Kennoway Tunnel and then continues fairly straight through the tunnel, but on this model it's going to curve back on itself after going into the tunnel. To get a gentle curve heading towards the tunnel, I needed to remove some of the straight track after the bridge. This is where things started to go wrong. The rails themselves cut easily enough, but I had trouble cutting the webbing for the sleepers and ended up pushing down too hard with the knife, which crushed part of the foam under the cork. I've shown before how this T-gauge flexi-track has a corkscrew twist to it, but Copydex has proven strong enough to overcome it, so I decided I could come back to this later to sort it out, and proceeded with laying another section of track. This time I tried leaving the Copydex for 10 to 15 minutes after applying it, before placing the track down, because I've heard that makes it go much more tacky. It really does. It immediately had a strong grip when I put the track down. The most recent piece of track stayed put just fine, but the twisting of the one over the bridge was worse than I'd thought. It wasn't just that it no longer had support where I'd accidentally crushed the foam under it, but the track was also pulling up the cork underlay beneath it, so it wasn't being anchored to anything at all. I tried filling the void with an extra section of cork and added more glue under the track and also under the cork. Whilst that was drying, I got to work on the next piece of track. This one and most of the curve of the previous one won't be in the scenic section, so it doesn't matter what their join looks like, so I decided to use fish plates for reliable alignment. It was quite a battle to get fish plates to go on though, even after filing the ends of the rails. Again, I put Copydex down for the whole length of the rail and left it for a bit to go more tacky, but I think that was a mistake this time. It didn't leave me any scope for making minor adjustments when putting the track down. I couldn't get the rails to go onto the fish plates, and trying to get them in actually managed to unfold enough to come off the other rails, so in the end neither rails were connected with them. I put down some extra glue at the join to try and use that to hold things where they should be, but it didn't work. The corkscrew of the track fought back too strongly, and for some reason on this occasion the Copydex wasn't holding the end of the curve in position either, so the join between track sections was a kink. I tried to at least get it flat with more glue, more weight over it, and some extra track sleepers and webbing beneath it. That did overcome the corkscrew, but still left a nasty kink and a slight misalignment. The extra glue over the bridge didn't work. I have video footage of me putting a screw into the track to see if that would work, but I don't actually remember what happened with that. I suspect it didn't hold well enough in the hardboard. For some reason I pressed on with completing the loop. I was disappointed to find the two halves of the layout didn't align at the back. I had previously found one side lower than the other and had added an extra layer of cork to compensate, but now that looks like it's too high, so there must be a little bit of movement possible even with the alignment dowels and joining bolts. On this occasion the layout was on my dining table but without the table middle extension in place, because it's really hard to put in place these days, so I suspect if the layout were put on a completely flat surface and was supported the whole way beneath, the two sides would line up. There was a relatively short section of track left to complete this outer loop, so I cut a piece to length and soldered some power cables to it. I didn't even try to use fish plates for this one. I decided I could solder the track joins later on. Once that was dry, I technically had a loop complete, but with some significant compromises along it. Before deciding what to do next, I tried running a locomotive along it. The track needed a good clean to get it running, but it was able to make it over the join after the bridge to start with, but then stopped being able to do it. Even if it were to keep going, it looked awful jumping over that massive change in track height. The next join wasn't much better. In the direction of travel for the downline, it kept derailing. Travel over this join won't be seen, so it doesn't matter if it's not pretty, but it does need to be reliable. The next join more or less worked, but not all that reliably, even after quite a lot of track cleaning. The problem here seems like it could probably be fixed with a bit more glue, as it's mainly the track lifting itself up that seems to be the issue. But overall, this bout of track laying had been very unsuccessful, so I had a rethink. I concluded I really needed to be able to firmly anchor the track vertically as well as horizontally, which was never going to work with the foam unless I had really long screws or nails, so I needed a different material under the cork. I still had what looked like just about enough plywood left for at least the scenic section end and curve, so drew the profile of the sea wall onto that and cut it with a jigsaw. I didn't quite get the shape right, there was too much of a sharp curve at the end, but on the whole it came out okay. Next up was a no going back step, removing the foam from under the track. The foam should be a good material from which to carve the shape of the landscape inland of the railway, so I left that part alone. Although the PVA glue held the foam nice and firmly onto the wooden base, it was still fairly straightforward to separate it. Most of the cork was stuck fairly firmly to the foam. I suspect some of the copy decks will have soaked through it from sticking the track down. By far the hardest thing to remove was the hardboard section for the bridge. I'd added so much glue to that to try and fix the track firmly that the cork and hardboard had basically become one, and trying to cut through it just tore it apart. So I removed that section of cork too. It came away from the track fairly easily. With all anchoring removed, the corkscrew tension in the track became very obvious. Next I made a paper template and cut the remaining curvy section of track bed. It was easiest to follow the shape of the existing cork. It's okay for it to be wider than the track bed here as it approaches Kenway Tunnel, because the land level behind the railway is at track level, and the sea wall gets wider to go around the cliffs. I considered trying to take a slice off from the foam to support most of the plywood, especially at the end and round the back, but given how uneven my previous foam shaping had been, and how incredibly messy the process is, I decided just using wooden blocks would be the overall easiest approach. I also tried to salvage the curve of track that I'd laid, but when trying to separate it from the cork, the rails came out from the sleepers. My experience with this track is that once that's happened, these rails aren't ever going to stay on the sleepers again. There was enough plywood left for the rest of the loop of track, so I cut those bits. For straight lines, I found the tenon saw worked well, and I find it much more pleasant to use than the jigsaw. To support the sections of plywood, I used a mix of existing blocks of wood and new cuts. Last time I spoke about how I had trouble getting those to exactly the right height for trains to cross over the two baseboard sections of the railway, but for these new sections further along it doesn't matter as much. If slight changes in track level don't look obvious, I'll be happy. The blocks at the front needed to be trimmed to the width of the track bed, so having arranged them where their height seemed to work best, I numbered them before trimming to size. I did need the one at the end to be exactly the same height as the existing block to avoid a visible hump or dip. 2 layers of plasticard sorted that out. For some reason, I thought it would be best to secure the blocks in place using some right-angle brackets, which was a little tricky where there was already track, but I just about had enough space. Having previously got track alignment that I was happy with, I didn't want to take this section of track up and have to do it all again. Small screws fitted nicely between the tracks to fix the plywood to the supporting blocks. I secured quite a few of the blocks using the brackets before realising it would actually be very easy to put screws in from beneath, which would also be much easier to disassemble in the future if it was needed for some reason, and which would add less weight to the board. So I removed the brackets and replaced each bracket and its pair of screws with one smaller screw. Eventually I had a firm plywood base all the way around the baseboard. Because not all of the track was salvageable, I had to order a few more lengths to have enough to complete both loops. And when the order arrived, I was pleased to find the new track didn't have anywhere near such a bad corkscrew to it. It wasn't completely flat, but it was a big improvement. While I was at it, I also ordered some flexi-track joiners. Those are basically just fish plates embedded in some slightly lower sleepers. The track joiners were good. They're much less difficult to slide onto the track because the fish plates are held firmly and the sleepers are strong enough to take a reasonable amount of pushing. That's not to say they're easy, it still took a fair bit of fiddling, but they went on successfully. I'd mainly been thinking of using these in the non-scenic section, but they seemed like they'd be a good way to go at the front of the layout. In these clips I'm attaching them to the track at the front of the layout. That's no longer springing so far into the air because I glued the existing cork, still attached to the track, onto the new plywood using copy decks. I stuck new sections of self-adhesive cork directly to the plywood. In other parts of the layout it's proven to stick much more strongly to wood than it did to the dusty foam. I shaped the track to go around the 180-degree turn in the same way as before, but this time I made myself a minimum radius template, and started with the inner curve. The template isn't a precise guide for the track, it's just for me to use to make sure no part of the curve turns too tightly. I kept fiddling with the curve until it eventually held something close to its final shape by itself, and then trimmed the rails and sleepers to match. I had also ordered new track cutters with the new track. My existing cutters are for making vertical cuts, but they're too wide to use on T-gauge track, so I bought side cutters. These seem to work much better. Not only is cutting from the side easier, they also seem to leave a cleaner cut. This time around I glued only the S-curve section of track to start with. That meant I could leave the copy decks to go tacky enough to have an instantly strong grip in order to hold the desired track alignment, but I'd still be able to adjust the rest of the curve later. This worked well. In particular, the track leading to the join with another piece stayed straight after I pushed it down. Previously, I was having to pin that in place firmly with my fingers when shaping the rest of the S-curve. I put lots of glue where the new track met the corkscrew track. For the rest of the curve, I didn't leave the copy deck secure for very long, I think less than 5 minutes. It gave it enough grip to hold the end of the track straight, but I was still able to make little adjustments to the rest of the curve. That was in the morning. By evening, I decided it had been long enough that I could remove the weights and lay a section of track on the outer loop, using the same technique. The next day I was happy with how those new curves looked, and the track joins didn't look terrible, but the rails still weren't aligned perfectly. That corkscrew in the rails was still fighting back, and over the bridge area the track was lifting from the cork. I suspect it would have gone a bit further if it hadn't been for the fish plates. Before deciding what to do next, I cleaned the rails and ran a train back and forth over the track join. It was mostly able to make it across without derailing, but its wheels were coming out of contact with the rails. Travelling away from the curve, there was actually a derailment on one occasion. Even when it stayed on and kept running, it didn't look good enough. The upline was better. The bad track wasn't lifting very far, so the train didn't lurch as much when going over the join. The downline definitely needed fixing though, so I added some track screws. I don't think I'll be able to completely disguise these. They have to be above sleeper level in order to pin the sleepers down, but I think it's a better trade-off than bad train running. Eventually, bridge girders might hide them a little bit. With the screws in place, the train looked a lot better running over that area. Further along the line in the up direction, the slight change in track level became much more obvious to me when a train was running over it, so at some point I'm going to trim or swap the taller blocks to level it out. Since the front area and 180-degree turn seemed to be working, I joined the outer loop up. The track from the first attempt was long enough to join up and just needed a little bit of trimming to fit. With a track joiner section, a solid level base and something that track screws could bite into, I got what looked like a level join. I left that for 24 hours to dry and then tested with the train again. It derailed. There was a kink in the track alignment, which was fairly inevitable for a join on a curve, but the culprit was one of the screws being right up against the inside of a rail, so I just needed to reposition that. Further along the back of the layout, the previous join between straight sections didn't look too good, but the train got over it without derailing. The way the coaches were jerking about, it looked like a derailment would probably be inevitable at some point though, so that needed fixing. One side of the rails looked like it had become a bit raised, but I had to push down quite hard on it to get it to go much lower, so I wondered if it was actually a thick layer of Copydex glue propping it up. I did a bit of excavation with a craft knife. It took a bit of cork with it too, but the end result was that I could screw the track down to be at the same level as the other piece, and while I was at it, also get their horizontal alignment much closer. The vertical alignment still didn't look perfect for one of the rails, which was now too low rather than too high, but it looked better and was the better way around for the direction that trains will run on this track. I could add a thin slice of plasticard under that side of the track, but I'm going to leave it and see how it goes, since it's not in a scenic section. Finally, I had one working looper track around this baseboard section. I ran a train along it a couple of times and it got all the way around smoothly in both directions. I decided that would be enough for now. To lay the rest of the inner loop I'd need both sections of the layout in place for a while. However, I couldn't resist seeing if the existing tracks did line up when the railway was on a flat surface, so briefly got the whole layout together. None of the joins across boards worked. I only actually tried the train across one of them, but it was obvious it wouldn't work across the other two. It's been quite a while since I first aligned the two sections of this railway, so it would seem that over time things have shifted a bit. Shortly after the last video, I bought some rods and nuts after it was suggested to me. If I replace the blocks of wood in the middle of the layout with these, then it might allow me to make minor adjustments to trackbed height when needed. I may also need to look at soldering the ends of the rails in place, as over time the Copytex does seem to relax its hold a little bit. This is becoming more frustrating than fun, but I'm confident I'll be able to get it working eventually. If there's one good thing about working with the tiny tolerances of T-gauge, it's that it makes N-gauge seem huge and easy going by comparison. That's all for now. Bye bye.